Hey guys, it's Layla from Ignite, and in today's video I'll be taking you through the 2020 Module A essay question and writing a thesis using the example of Stephen Daldry and Virginia Woolf. But before I get into that, please do like and subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying our content and click the bell for notifications. And if you're looking for more resources to help you with your HSC English studies, check out our website at Ignite HSC. But for now, let's get into today's video. Okay, so my goal in today's clip is to walk you through the Module A essay question from the 2020 HSC paper in paper 2. And as I'm walking you through that, show you an exemplar thesis statement using the comparison of Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and Stephen Daldry's The Hours. Irrespective really of what text you're studying for Module A, my process of unpacking the question and really parts of the thesis statement would apply to any question or any text rather that you're studying. So stay tuned and the video will be really relevant to you if you are a HSC Advanced English student. Let's take a look at the wording of last year's question. So it reads here, in textual conversations, the later text is often seen as a shadow, lacking the originality and power of the earlier. To what extent is this statement true of the two prescribed texts you have studied in Module A? So before even getting into the exam and knowing how to answer this question, there are a few points on preparation that I wanted to talk through first. So obviously, when you're preparing for the common module, Module A, B and C, not the comprehension, we can't prepare for that one apart from doing practice essays or practice responses. We're expecting that you have an exemplar essay prepared. Now, my advice with Module A specifically is that you have an essay that is exploring two broad and central ideas between the two texts, and your essay structure is working through exploring how the comparative study enhances and deepens or challenges your idea of that key concept that is explored between the texts. And the essay structure would follow something like, obviously, your introduction and then text 1, text 2, both of those paragraphs exploring one idea, and then text 1 in paragraph 3 and text 2 in paragraph 4 exploring the second idea. Paragraphs 2 and 4 on the second text in the conversation, the later one, should be a little bit longer, and that paragraph would carry the job of referring back to the previous and unpacking how the textual conversation has not only offered a new way of understanding the original text and vice versa, how the original text informs the later text, but also how your understanding of that key concept that connects the texts is deepened through the comparative study. So that's the structure that you're going with. Now, through using that structure, it opens the scope for you to answer any kind of question, because that structure lends itself towards the power of textual dialogue, remembering that the purpose of this study is how textual conversations offer you a more enriching ability to understand and to extend your ability to understand the meanings that are locked within a text. Noting that meaning in a text is not confined by the author's necessary intentions, but it's rather fluid and in this constant state of being negotiated, and its relationality to the other texts in this pair is a way of proving that. Okay, so that's what we're engaging with here. So you must have an exemplar essay, a broad exemplar essay that you can use to answer the question in the exam. Now, it's important here to note that you're not going into the exam with the intention then of regurgitating that exemplar. You're using that exemplar to help you answer the question, and you will relinquish parts of its wording to incorporate the wording of the question in the exam. So the exemplar, ironically, is being taken into the exam with the intent of changing it to make sure that you answer the question. And the reason I think this rationale works is because you're under a lot of time pressure in the exam. And with that time constraint, it is just not feasible for you to walk in there not knowing what you're going to put in those paragraphs or what quotes you're going to use. You need to have an idea of that at the very least but then the way that you express that analysis and the way that you write your topic sentences and thesis statements will of course depend very heavily on the precise wording of the question in the exam. Next point on timing, you have 40 minutes per section in paper 2. If you have 40 minutes to complete the entirety of the section, your exemplar essay should not take you 40 minutes to write. You need to time it before the exam. The exemplar essay, I would say, should be roughly 33 to 35 minutes to factor in 5 minutes of reading the question, unpacking the question, and knowing how you're going to incorporate the question into your response. And you need to really think as you're writing your thesis, drawing on my third point here, about how that thesis is going to foreground what the essay will go on to discuss. The way that you construe the question must very cleverly encapsulate the evidence and the ideas that you want to raise later on to ensure that there is no inconsistency in the argument that you bring forward. So you have to keep that in mind as well. Having said that, let's now go through the question. So when we are looking at a past paper question or any essay question, there are 3 steps we need to follow. We must identify the question's key terms in the exam. Pencil, pen in hand, underline those key terms to make sure you don't miss any. Then we need to unpack them, where you can apply what I like to call micro questions, words like what, how, to what extent, to the question's key terms, and that way you're kind of fleshing out what those questions mean in the context of the study, and it's also offering scope for you to unpack the question's key terms in a way that works for what you want to go on to discuss in your essay. And then step number 3 is to connect the key terms in the question. So if there are a number of key terms there and they bear some relationality, you might want to unpack what that is. For example, if an aspect of form and a key theme is given in the question, what is it about the form that enables that particular key theme to be explored by way of example? So those are the steps we need to follow. So applying them here, what are our key terms in the question that we've been given? So we've got the phrase here, seen as a shadow, and the other phrase, lacking the originality and power of the earlier. So looking at those key terms, we need to think, well, why or how is one text potentially seen as a shadow? And why or why not does it lack the originality and power of the earlier text, if indeed that original text had any originality or power to begin with? So there's some initial thoughts that I'm thinking about, and you can see inherent in those thoughts are those micro questions. What, how, why, to what extent? Now, I think at this point it's useful for us to reflect on what the actual purpose of Module A is, right? Now, in the comparison of your 2 texts, the later text holds the power and the ability of providing a new lens through which you can access that original text. So in many ways, the purpose of that intertextual dialogue is not for one text to on its own stand as original or powerful, but its power indeed lies in its ability to provide new ways of understanding the meanings contained in that earlier text. And in a reciprocal fashion, that earlier text also provides a means through which you can understand the meaning of that latter text, because often the later text, the adaptation, makes no sense unless you have looked at that original text. And this negotiation of meaning and this connection between the 2 texts in the pair speaks to really the fundamental basis of intertextuality, which is that no meaning in a text is purely caveated by the author's intention, but rather that meaning is constantly being renegotiated and reformed based on the connections, the infinite connections that one can see between texts. And this is a hyperbolic example because we have a pair of texts where one composer has drafted their text with the intent of creating a new way of understanding the former. So to put this simply, textual dialogue allows for an opportunity to illuminate new ways of appreciating another text, unlocking meanings you may not have previously encountered. So through doing this within the textual dialogue, we know that the later text, and I've used an image here of the hours to showcase, that it takes, the persona of Virginia Woolf here and reflects her persona throughout time in different women placed in different feminist contexts. So the image there itself speaks to how Stephen Daldry's text is not necessarily a shadow, but rather a torch, right? Illuminating new ways of understanding what is going on in a text, the text on which it is based. So, having said that here, let's look at the primary key terms. So, seen as a shadow, I think the micro questions worth applying there are why or why not. And I think here that we should note, text is not a shadow, but a torch unfolding the contemporary relevance and meanings contained in the older text. And in terms of lacking originality, again, you can ask yourself why and how. Originality cannot apply to any text if we're thinking about intertextuality more broadly. All texts are kind of locked in this intertextual dialogue, evoking the repetitiveness of their meaning. And what I mean by that is when we think about the theory behind intertextuality, we know that there is nothing purely original in any text, even the original text on which the adaptation is based. Okay, now let's apply the micro questions to unpack the key terms in this question. So the first key phrase, seen as a shadow. I would ask myself, why or why not is the later text seen as a shadow? And when we think about it, the authorial intent behind Dalloway's text, or any text in the pair, is to provide a new way of understanding the original text, right? It's not a shadow in that regard, and originality is not its aim. Its aim is to unlock those multiplicity of meanings contained in the text. And by virtue of that role, it's not that it lacks the originality, but rather provides originality to the original text through contemporizing its meaning. And lacking the originality as an extension here, we could apply the questions why and how. And I think that originality really cannot apply to any text when we think about the theory behind intertextuality more broadly. What we learn in this study is that texts are construed by virtue of their relationality and implied or explicit connections to other texts. And the comparison between Stephen Daldry and Virginia Woolf certainly proves that. So thinking about how this might look in a thesis statement, I've got an example on the next slide, but before I get into that, I just want to reiterate the key point that you don't want to simply restate the question and you don't want to ignore the question. You're trying to construe the question in a way that works for what you want to go on to say in your essay. Before showing you the thesis, I just wanted to flag, typically for Module A thesis statements, because the theory of textual dialogue and textual conversations really embeds itself into this essay, you're playing around with that idea about how a comparison between texts brings light to new meaning. Often the first sentence, I would say in Module A, will deal with intertextuality, and I think this question lends itself to that as well. You want to deal with how intertextual dialogue opens new ways of understanding texts. And then in your second or maybe even a third sentence, the Module A thesis statements tend to be a little bit lengthier because you're dealing with two texts as opposed to the one. Then you will unpack the intertextual dialogue in specific relation to the text and maybe start to introduce what ideas elucidate the meanings between the texts. So what ideas you would base your paragraphs on to showcase how meaning has been represented between the two texts, right? I'll show you my exemplar now. So, in the process of textual dialogue, the later text, otherwise known as the hypertext, is seen as not a shadow, but rather a torch illuminating new ways of understanding the original text. Indeed, this dialogue elucidates how no text is purely original. All texts are engaged in a web of intertextual dialogism, with no meaning found as purely new. Stephen Daldry shines light on Virginia Woolf, contextualizing the text through stages of feminism, empowering the contemporary relevance of Mrs. Dalloway. So you can see how the first few sentences there have kind of embedded the key terms of the question to argue that Daldry is not a shadow and that there is no argument for him lacking the originality of the earlier text because originality cannot be deemed in any text. Text's meaning is configured by the reader who is drawing connections between other texts, which is exactly what you're doing, right, in this module. So, seen not as a shadow, no text is purely original, empowering the contemporary relevance, drawing on the word power there. You can see how I've kind of broken apart the key parts of the quote and I've incorporated them in a way that works for what I would go on to say in my essay. Module A is the hardest module. There is so much that you're doing. You've got two texts, two contexts, two forms to unpack, and then plus you're engaging with this tricky idea of textual conversations, right, which is asking you to discuss how meaning is constantly being reconfigured between texts. So hopefully this exemplar has given you some direction in how you can contain that in a thesis statement. But what I do also hope you note is that the questions of Module A do tend to be quite broad, and that means that your exemplar, you can be kind of comfortable that you can reconstruct it in a way that works for what you want to go on to say. That concludes my content for today's video. If you have any questions, please do comment below. And if you are enjoying our content, please do like and subscribe to our channel. If you want extra resources that give you close analysis on your text, notes on context and form, and exemplar responses, check out our website at Ignite HSC. We have loads on there to really enhance your studies in HSC English. But for now, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.